beer, it's good for you.
Hello and welcome to the video. Within this video I'll be sharing my new tried and tested recipe and all of the methods required for brewing and fermenting a low ABV and yet tasty lager recipe. During this one's development, its project name was simply Low ABV Tasty Lager, and this has remained as it simply feels like the most apt name for it. This recipe has had a longer than usual development time, but I'm very happy with the end result and I hope you will be too. So let's get on with it. Within this guide video, I'll take you through all of the steps in order. Let's start with a look at this recipe's vital statistics. As you can see, the recipe offers an approximate ABV of just 2%, and the BUGU here shows the relationship between bitterness and alcohol at 0.38, making this one very easy drinking, but the final gravity of 1.004 gives a nice dry and yet crisp finish. This recipe, like the vast majority of my shared recipes, has been written and designed by me and has gone through various stages of development and tweaking to reach its current state, which gets my full approval, so please do brew with confidence. The full recipe can be found within the video's description, which is underneath the video window when viewed on a desktop computer. You will also find a link there to the recipe in full on Brewfather, which can be used free of charge with some restrictions. I do strongly suggest that you fully convert the recipe before ordering in your ingredients so that you're actually brewing the recipe as intended. I also suggest that you brew this recipe as is the first time rather than tweaking it. Resisting that temptation, I promise you, will be worth it, especially in the case of this recipe compared to many, as there is a thinner line of tolerance between make or break. I have an easy guide to recipe conversion using Brewfather on my channel as shown on screen now. Within this video, this recipe is being brewed using a G40 brewing system from Grainfather to the volume of 14 litres or approximately 3.69 US liquid gallons, but as part of the conversion process this can be scaled and shaped to suit your own brewing system and volume requirements. Shown on screen now is the water profile that I recommend for use with this recipe. It is ideal for a beer of this type where we want the delicate nature of a lager style to shine through without too many minerals in the way. I suggest that you plan your water profile ahead. After all, beer is mostly water and its balance is important, then that it must suit the beer that you are brewing. Brewfather also has very good documentation on how to use the software to make the necessary water changes too. Due to this assistance, it really is an easy process, so I suggest that all brewers, irrespective of experience, start treating their water as soon as possible for the very best of end results. Let's now get brewing, and this starts with the mash, which has some preparation steps to go through before we can start the actual mash. The very first step is to preheat your mash water to the first mash step temperature, which is now shown on screen for this recipe. If you are using a brewing system which is less than 220 volts, then you would be best advised to overshoot this temperature to cut down on waiting time later. You will note that this is a high mash-in temperature, and this is for the reason that we want to create a certain level of unfermentable sugars here to balance the recipe in terms of its taste. I then added this recipe's grain bill and gave it a really good stir using Kegland's mash stirrer. It is certainly a lot faster and easier this way. If you do not have one, then be sure to give the grain a very good thorough stir to ensure that all of the grains are wet and in the mix. This step within your brew is without doubt the most important one, as a sloppy stir here has the potential to have a detrimental effect on the rest of your brew. With the mash preparation now complete, it was time to start the actual mash itself. Let's now take a look at the grain bill so that we can understand this recipe further. Firstly, at 70% of our grist we have Bohemian Pilsner malt. If you can obtain it, then I suggest using this malt from Wyoming. It simply has excellent taste and aroma that really helps this recipe sing. Failing this, then look for a flavourful Pilsner malt from maltsters that could include floor malted varieties. What we are actually looking for here is a higher quality and taste-based Pilsner malt. Not only will this malt provide some flavour, but it will also provide the vast majority of the fermentables for this recipe. Then at 20% of the grain bill we have Caramunich I malt, or simply a light coloured caramelised Munich malt that will enhance the beer's flavour with notes of caramel and biscuit. The end result here is of course very subtle, like any good European authentic lager will be. Then at 5% we also require some aroma malt, which can also be known as honey malt, aromatic malt or melanoidin malt. These malts seek to emulate the flavours obtained by doing a decoction mash. The end result makes for a more malty flavour as well as very nice notes of honey and biscuit. Within this recipe, this malt offers some very pleasant extra flavour that falls into the background. Then lastly we have 5% Carapils malt, which adds in some much needed extra body and head retention without change to colour or flavour. The grain bill that I've just presented to you has been the main area of tweaking for this recipe, in providing good but subtle flavour and aroma despite the lower level of alcohol. After mash out was finished, I lifted the grain basket and performed a slow even sparge over the grain bed. In my opinion, the sparge tends to be rushed or skipped by way too many homebrewers these days. If you take your time and give the sparge the attention it deserves, you will be rewarded with a higher level of efficiency and, according to my taste palette, a better malt flavour too. Let's now look at the boil. While sparging, I had already set the brewing system to start ramping up to the boil, so it was not long before a boil temperature was reached. As you can now see on screen, this recipe uses a modern 30-minute boil, and I strongly suggest sticking to this to minimise boiling off flavour from both our malt and hops, which is very important to this recipe due to its lower ABV content, and we will obviously want to encourage as much flavour as possible to balance this off. This recipe uses just one hop type, Saaz. You will note the low IBU levels here. This is due to the lower alcohol, so as such we do not need to balance this recipe to the same levels that we would a regular one. Here is a look at Saaz from within the hop control software. This hop's main descriptors are earthy, herbal and floral, but as you can see you can expect some spice and grassy tones too. It is fair to say that Saaz is very connected to the lager style and is very popularly used in European lagers due to its unique flavour and aroma. European hops may not be as powerful as those big American or New Zealand hops, but I know still enjoys the familiar yet subtle Saaz aroma during the boil. It was then time to cool and transfer into my fermenter. When it comes to yeast for this one, I have some recommendations. Firstly, if you want this to be a genuine lager, then either Fermentis 3470 or Lallemand Nova Lager are both very good choices, and I've enjoyed batches that I've split between these two. However, for this recipe I personally prefer the pseudo lager route with Lutra Quake on the basis that it adds a little extra flavour that helps a low ABV beer like this one sing just that little bit more. So for this reason I've listed Lutra within this recipe, but feel free to try this with 3470 or Nova Lager or all three for comparison. Doing a split batch between the three different types of yeast is certainly a very interesting exercise for sure. Also to mention that within the recipe I have a fermentation temperature for Lutra as 20 degrees Celsius, which will give you a very clean lager-like result. However, if you are able to, then I would suggest fermentation under pressure for an even cleaner result. There is little point increasing the temperature though, as each time I have fermented this recipe with Lutra, the fermentation is totally done in less than 24 hours. Let's now take a look at the finished beer, starting with the pour, and after this I will take you through my tasting notes. As you can see here, the close-up to the pour is very nice light golden colour, but once in the glass the end beer is a beautiful golden amber. This batch has been given some gelatin treatment to clear it and has come out looking sparkling clear despite the use of cake. This beer has been under 12 psi of pressure, which is 0.83 bars, and I'm also using this pressure for serving too. The example you see here is at around the 4-week point from kegging and has conditioned flavour-wise very nicely in this time. So let's now go through my tasting notes, starting with aroma. Aroma. The aroma here is nice and fresh with a low level of floral and spice from the Saaz hops. Flavour. Here we have very easy entry into a crisp, light and delicate malty flavouring that ends with a dry finish that has low levels of herbal, floral and spicy notes. This beer has a light body and is very refreshing and thirst quenching. The flavour profile here is deceptive in that some drinkers may feel that they are drinking a beer with double the actual ABV, especially when served with a higher level of carbonation. And here are my notes for this recipe. I believe that it is fair to say that this beer is tasty and yet delicate in the way that only a lager can be. My earlier attempts at this recipe were mostly of a lower ABV nature than this end recipe, which offers 2%. The trouble was they ended up being too watery and the flavours were not on point. In the end I realised that the only way to get around this was by adding in other flavours either via dry hops or with other ingredients, which I felt then moved away from the objective of a lager or a lager-like beer that was lower ABV. It was only once I hit 2% ABV that this objective was able to be realised. If you want more from this beer in the taste department and are kegging, then simply increase the carbonation until you detect a slight carbonic bite on the tongue and then stop. This is the sweet spot. Here is my final impression for this one as follows. This is a low ABV light lager that reaches the spots that are usually reserved for lagers of a higher ABV. This is ideal for lunchtime drinking or those long summer evenings when you want something easy drinking and lower in alcohol to refresh and quench your thirst. So there you have my tasting notes. I'll be very happy to see yours via the comments section of this video once you have this one brewed and ready for drinking. I do hope that you found this video useful, informative and interesting. If so, why not consider liking and subscribing? For further support you can join the channel's Facebook group, and if you would like to support the channel then check out the channel's merchandise store, as all profits go back into the channel. Until next time, happy brewing!